Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And as I mentioned in my opening statements, it is alarming to hear about the reports of unaccompanied teenagers who enter our country illegally through the southern border and end up in the hands of human traffickers, and they're often forced to work long hours and very dangerous jobs. Um, in your previous statements, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've compared your agency's work in releasing minors into the U.S. as an assembly line, encourage your staff to expedite the release of children. Um, my question is, how many unaccompanied minors have actually entered the U.S. in the past 3 years?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. And just to clarify, I didn't compare the work that we do at HHS to an assembly line. I said that we had to make sure that we had operations that would move quickly and efficiently and safely to make sure that children were placed, because by law, we have custody of those unaccompanied children only temporarily. We must find a sponsor for them. And if we don't act expeditiously with safety in mind to find them a sponsor, then we start to have a backlog of kids at CBP, the Customs and Border Protection Agency's headquarters, which do not have places for children. So what we have to do is make sure we're being efficient, always with safety paramount in our minds. And that's what we have been doing. We have placed more than, I believe it's more than 250,000 kids in the last few years in various sponsors' homes, and we will continue to do that process every day. But first and foremost, our responsibility, as you're aware, is to provide the care and custody of children temporarily until we can find a vetted sponsor to place them with.
So do you have the number of how many unaccompanied minors have entered in the last 3 years?
I could get you the precise number, but I believe it's, I said 250, it's probably over 300,000 over the last 3 years or so.
What is the average time that a minor, when they're held in your custody before they're released to a sponsor?
Excellent question, Mr. Chairman, because it depends. We have children in different categories because some children we know are likely to have a close relative somewhere nearby in the U.S., and we are able to place a child who has a primary relative a lot sooner and more with more safety than we do with a child who doesn't have a close relative in the U.S. And so it depends. It could be somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks for a child where we have identified a parent in the U.S. who is able to take custody. If there is no close family relative, it could take several weeks. In fact, we have kids who've been with us for far longer than several weeks.
What steps have you taken to expedite the release of minors from your custody to sponsors other than the parents or first-degree relatives?
We've done a number of things over the last few years. Now that we have the capacity to do so, for example, we have integrated the process of discharge of the vetting process for children and the sponsors, consolidated it into one operation rather than have the more than 300 different programs that have kids do it individually. This allows us to have much more efficiency and be able to have better sight in the people who are requesting to sponsor. We also have more technology now that we can use, whether it's fingerprinting or documentation of the different identifiers, where people live, where they work. That information is now easier for us to access, and therefore we can begin to get a sense if there is a sponsor that will qualify to take a child.
And what follow-up does the department do once the minors are placed in this with a sponsor that is actually not their parents?
Yeah. Appreciate the question, Mr. Chairman. If the sponsor is not their parent, and we talk of immediate family members because they're not all parents, but about more than 3/4 of the kids that we place end up with an immediate family member. That means a parent, adult sibling, it could be a grandparent, but for those that don't have a close family relative, we will go through a process, and in some cases, we'll do home inspections to find out if the site will be a good place for this child. So we go far further with non-relatives in doing the vetting than we do with close family members.
But once they're in there, do you do a follow-up?
Okay, so once we release them, as you're aware, Congress, you all passed a law that gave us jurisdiction over these kids only while they are temporarily in our custody. we lose authority over the children. We have no custody authority over the kids once we place them with a vetted sponsor. And so that child and the sponsor have no obligations to stay in touch with us once we have released them into their care.
So
And
no follow-up then?
we do follow up voluntarily because we think it's good family practice, child welfare practice for us to try to make sure that the handoff goes well. So we do post-release services. We will try, for example, to reach the child and the sponsor 3 different times after they've been released. And so we'll try to make a phone call. If they're close by, we might do a visit, but we try to find out how they're doing to see how the transition is going. But they're under no obligation to respond to us or to communicate with us. So we don't have the authority to require that.
So what do you do to ensure that the minors, once they're released, that they're not put to work illegally?
Great question, because we have no jurisdiction. The Department of Labor has jurisdiction over labor violations. We've had many discussions with members of Congress on this subject. If you so choose, Congress so chooses to give us more authorities, we will implement the authorities you give us with the resources that you give us. But at this stage, Mr. Chairman, our authority to go out and try to make sure that that child now in the community setting is doing well is not there. And we don't have the resources as well to try to do the follow-up. What we do voluntarily, we do because we think it's good child welfare practices to try to monitor the kid as best we can.
This question may be, you've already answered it, but if you want to expand on it just a minute, but let me just ask, do you have an idea of how many unaccompanied minors that the department has completely lost contact with since you became secretary?
So let me make sure if you dissect the question, you're asking a question that the answer will be, we don't lose children because once we discharge them to a vetted sponsor, we don't have jurisdiction over them. So we can't track them because there's no obligation on their part or the sponsor's part to stay in touch with us. That handoff, and that's why it's so important for us to do a good vetting process, because once we do the handoff, Congress did not give us authority to try to monitor them. So we can't lose a child that we don't have the authority to track. And that's why while they're in our care, they're not exploited by companies to work. While they're in our care, they get the health care that they need. While they're in our care, we look for the most responsible person we can find after vetting to release them to as a sponsor.
Yeah, so once y'all release them, then there's nothing.
Congress did not give us authority to follow up with them.
Okay, thank you.